Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to circumambulate a really rich, complicated topic in Jungian thought. The relationship between the body, the soul, and the spirit. How that shows up in the consulting room. How do we understand and hold the phenomena of being embodied subtly in its grossest forms? And how do we understand this unbroken line between the subtlest aspects of our consciousness and the grossest, most concrete aspects of our physical lives? How do we hold that in a way that's useful, that's part of an evolutionary process in our psychospiritual growth? And just what's some language we can wrap around this huge, huge topic? So we're going to give that a shot today.
Yeah, it's such a big topic, isn't it? And it's one that Jung actually wrote a lot about. I feel like I say that all the time. It's like no matter what the topic is, he wrote a lot about it. But he did. He really was interested in the body and the role that the body plays and how we relate to the body and the fact that we're suffering in that respect as moderns. And I want to lead off this morning with a quote from Nietzsche, who, Jung read and was inspired by. Nietzsche says, "There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy."
You know what came up for me about Jung and the body is not just that he was interested and wrote a lot about it, but he lived it at Bollingen, which was this house that he built, with some help, but he designed it. And there's a round stone tower. He painted mandalas on the walls. He carved things into the side of his stone house. It's really fairly primitive. And he felt that man should live close to nature, use his hands, and be physically close to the earth in every lived way. Lisa, you and I had the good fortune to be able to visit it, but it impressed me with how connected Jung was to earth, body, instinct, nature, and that he said of Bollingen that was where he was his truest self.
Yeah, and he used to get there by just taking his sailboat out from his home and sailing up the lake. So I'm remembering someone, it may have been my analyst at one point, saying that Jung was really just a lusty peasant. And that comes across if you read Deirdre Baer's biography, that there were these different aspects of him, but he had this friend, Ruth was her first name. I cannot remember her last name right now, but she became a very close friend of the family. And she was just this kind of down to earth, salt of the earth kind of person who really spoke to that sort of lusty peasant side of Jung, that he was very embodied.
So what I'm thinking about here is the connection between body and physical process and instinct. What do we kind of come hardwired for? It comes pre-installed at the factory, my somewhat humorous term for evolution and nature. And according to Jung, there are 5 instincts. One of them is creativity. And I think we can recognize that in ourselves. We all want to make things, bring things into being, whether it's a garden or the next great American novel. Reflection, self-reflection, which includes spiritual or religious instinct and the need to make meaning. We are hardwired for activity, simply movement, doing things, sexuality, and hunger, which ranges from physical hunger all the way to hunger for knowledge or for love or for a number of other things. And I appreciate very much that this is simply our nature. This is what is. This is in the ground of our being as the creatures that we are, just like zebras have stripes, and whales do what they do, that this is part of us. And we often somehow bypass it in today's world, especially with all the screen time that we're spending.
Well, Deb, I'm glad that you brought up instinct, because I think that goes right to the root of things. I mean, instincts are rooted in the body and make themselves known through bodily urges, whether that's to get up and move when you've been sitting down for a long time or other kinds of urges. And Jung said repeatedly that the loss, this is one of the ways he says it, he says the loss of instinct is primarily responsible for the pathological condition of our contemporary culture. He says that again and again and again in different words.
Wow. That we have moved too far from our very basic nature is how I understand that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that if we move too far from these instincts, maybe there's someone out there who's thinking, well, so what? Who cares if you don't move a lot or if you spend a lot of time on the screen? But the issue there is that the instincts are also connected to the soul and to spirit. So there's a connection to the archetypal world at the other end of this imagined polarity. So we're really at risk of losing something that is our human vitality in every realm, not just physical activity.
And the question is, do we really lose it, or do we set up obstructive and artificial defenses against the underlying unity, which Jung called a neurosis? And the core of the word neurosis is to split things apart, or probably more accurately, to pretend that things are split apart, and then to set in motion complicated mechanisms to prove that to ourselves over and over again, which can interfere with our true and essential nature. So we can pretend that the body and the mind are separate, is a kind of Descartes idea. It's been around for a long time. It's also, before that, part of this Gnostic split, that in very, very early Gnostic Christianity, there was an idea of a true spiritual world where all things were in a divine spiritual order. And then through celestial tragedy, one aspect of this divine order, Sophia, kind of breaks off and formulates this travesty of a physical world, which we are still all caught in, and that this physical life is some kind of abomination, and that the true Gnostics have to overcome and never return to this abomination again. And that idea shows up in many transcendental religions across the East.
It's a tricky business, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we do have to make separations or everything will just be all merged into one sort of undifferentiated whole. But if we separate things too much, then we get into what you just talked about, Joseph, of these terrible splits, which lead to neurosis, an unhealthy one-sidedness. That it's not balanced, not connected, to our detriment.
Yeah, and Jung writes about this kind of major split that happened in the Western psyche. He writes about that some in Ion, and saw that it did predispose us to neurosis. And I think that there's a way in which his whole psychology is about offering a way to restore this connection. He talks about how dreams can help us restore our connection with the instincts. He says the interpretation of dreams enriches consciousness to such an extent that it relearns the forgotten language of the instincts.
Yeah.
And he even says that the source of dreams are often repressed instincts. So he saw a real connection again between the unconscious, between the archetypal realm and the instincts. And in fact, that moves us into this big idea that he had about the connection between the instincts and the archetype.
The way that I've always especially resonated to, that Jung imaged how instincts and archetypes are related and connected to one another, is as this great continuum where, like the color wheel we all learned somewhere back when, red merges into orange, yellow, green, blue, etc., and finally into the violet and ultraviolet range. And someone offered an image of this extending out like a great circle that goes way far out into space and reaches to behind the moon. And that's the place where we can't see, behind the moon, that the ultra red and the ultraviolet somehow join, connect, and relate to one another. So it's a bit of a mystery, and yet it's a great image of this great stream of connection. And that's why the body is so important, is, right. Everything's connected.
Jung said that the instinct is sort of the infrared part of the spectrum, and the archetype, the image, is the ultraviolet, but that there are two versions of the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I can tell right now all I'm going to be doing this whole podcast is reading quotes. Here's one of my favorites. The archetype as an image of instinct is a spiritual goal toward which the whole nature of man strives. It is the sea to which all rivers wend their way, the prize which the hero wrests from the fight with the dragon.
That's really lovely.
So these instincts have a spiritualized form. And I think what Jung's critique is, we've just gone there. We've just become focused on the spiritual aspect, but we're forgetting the body. We're forgetting the infrared part of the spectrum.
And that was a core source of suffering around the time of the birth of psychoanalysis. If we go back to the beginning, Freud, who was a scientist concerned with physical phenomena, he was a neurologist, and he was looking at these things that were wrong with people's bodies in this very repressed Victorian era. And what he surmised, and of course Jung also launched from that same platform, is that human beings had been in such violent refusal to acknowledge their instincts and to seek some way of engaging the tension and the power of their instinctive urges, that they were making themselves sick. And until people could get back in touch with that instinctive level, their symptoms, psychological and physical, were not going to resolve.
Right. Whatever is repressed or denied falls into the body. And we have, modern neurobiology that backs that up. And I'm thinking of Bessel van der Kolk's very important book, The Body Keeps the Score.
So we're sort of finding our way into the realm of psychosomatic phenomena of where the body remembers things, the connection, which is always mysterious, between psychology, feelings, soul, and physical manifestations of illness. And yet I think we all recognize that there is this connection. Things do show up in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not so much that they show up in the body like a journey, in as much as they kind of start in the mind and then they get into a car and then they drive down into an organ, per se, but that the body and the mind are contiguous, that as something sprouts in the psyche, it simultaneously manifests in the body, that there is no actual point where you can unsnap the mind from the body like a garment.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, we have limits to our consciousness. We often have limits as to what the ego can attend to. So if we're trained by our culture to only attend to ideas, all the other phenomena that's simultaneously happening in the body or other dimensions is falling into that kind of personal unconscious, this unattended sphere.
Mm-hmm.
So part of working with the body in a clinical setting is training the ego to widen its sphere of consideration and monitoring, and to notice what happens simultaneously in various realms.
I'll pepper this with another quote. He says, "For what is the body? The body is merely the visibility of the soul, the psyche, and the soul is the psychological experience of the body. Soul and body are not two things, they are one." That's from the Zarathustra lectures. I like what you're saying, and I want to pick up on it. There's a way that all of what we know about ourselves originates in the body. And it's in the body first and is in a kind of unformulated state. And a lot of what we're doing in analysis, I think, is trying to formulate that which is not yet quite able to be formulated. So it's important in clinical work to attend to the subtle sensations that are in the body. That's where feelings arise. You know, feelings are called feelings because we feel them in our bodies. We may not know that. We may just feel a disturbance of consciousness and then we say it's anger or we're trying to think about it. But we may have lost that connection with it arose first in my body. And now I'm trying to find language for it, so that there's something about making it conscious and being able to relate to it in a more refined way because we've been able to put our hands around it through languaging it.
Oh, I think that's so important of making those connections. And I'm also thinking about, and this is how we arrive in the world as little infants, as it's all about the body. It's not about explaining anything to that 2-day-old infant. It's about the holding and the feeding, the rocking, the singing. And now, thanks to all these neurobiological researches, we know that all that stuff actually activates brain development, the foundation for everything. And we do it through the body.
Right. I mean, this is what the early thinkers around attachment, John Bowlby and others, were responding to, was being aware that these World War II orphans who were kind of housed in these orphanages where they were fed, they were changed, you know, they had their basic needs met, but many of them suffered or even died because of failure to thrive. And they realized it was because they weren't being held enough. So this sort of embodied contact, it's so important, and that's now been really backed up. And so this made it clear that something very important that we need for surviving and even thriving is this kind of attuned attachment, a lot of which is physical. And, an attuned mother who's holding her baby and carrying her baby a lot, that being held and carried in early infancy actually contributes to the myelinization of the nerves. So there are physiological processes that are kind of kindled by this embodied contact.
Absolutely. And the same goes for hearing and the language that we hear from the time we're born, which is why mothers talk and sing to their babies. Visual development, what we take in through our eyes goes right over into the right hemisphere of the brain. And so it's physiology, but you're mentioning, Lisa, the attachment part of having someone who holds you, who cares. So here's the connection between body and soul, of our ensouled sense of self, that I am connected to myself and to a significant other or others.
Yes, that it's through our sensate experience of the world and of other people that we bridge that very secret inner life that only we know about, with the challenges and the joys and the stimulation of things that we don't control or don't originate from within ourselves. So the I-thou experience can only happen with a body in any credible way. And that's the basis of not only external object relations, but even internal object relations. How do we dance between I and thou in all its forms?
Yeah. Yeah. And Jung says in so many places, he says over and over again, that there's no such thing as body and mind, but body and mind or soul are the same life, subject to the same laws. And what the body does is happening in the mind, and in the soul and in the spirit. And in a way, this must sound to some listeners like, wow, this isn't new news, that whole body, mind, spirit thing has been out there for quite a while. But I think kind of knowing it as a concept and taking it in and seeing what some of the specific connections are, and then living it as an embodied reality are kind of different things. And that's why I mentioned Jung's time at Bollingen, of where he could physically live his connection with his body and instincts.
I want to mention, just in a very pragmatic way, that even though most of our listeners are familiar with the idea of the body-mind unity, making that a practical reality is truly a discipline, and depending on how we were raised or what was prioritized in our education, that can be very challenging. For instance, a very common modern diagnosis is alexithymia. And alexithymia is just a clever word for the inability to name the emotion that is happening in the body. That something as simple as having an impoverished emotional language keeps our body states, our feeling states, in an amorphous, unrelated, and undefined state. And in that way, part of the body is not claimed as territory to be developed or territory to be acknowledged as we are going through the world and trying to differentiate what's good for us and what's not good for us.
Yeah, that's a great point, Joseph. And I think what you're both saying there is that we may not even be aware of how much we're cut off from our bodies. Here's another quote. In our civilization, we suffer very much from the fact that we consist of a mind and have lost the body. And that's also from Zarathustra. And what that brings up for me is the way that the body has really almost become synonymous with shadow. So much of the body is in the shadow, and the shadow is in the body in our culture. There's so much that we have to split off from or deny, whether that's feelings, which are often messy and uncomfortable, or whether it's, shameful bodily processes that we learn early on not to talk about or reveal. I also think that, partly due to kind of marketing marketers make money by convincing us that we're inadequate in some way, or we're not as happy as we could be. And a lot of it is aimed at our relationship with our bodies. And, over the course of the past century, when advertising has really become pervasive, there's just so much messaging out there that our bodies could be better in some way. And I think it really has shifted the way that we think about our bodies. Now, especially that's kind of on steroids with platforms like Instagram, where we can just be made to feel at every turn that our bodies are inadequate in some way, or that they're not good enough, that there's something to be ashamed of, or that there's something that we need to improve on, rather than they're just an essential part of us. They just deserve our love and acceptance. Jung says, the body is a terribly awkward thing, and so it is omitted. We can deal with things spiritually so much more easily without the despicable body. I really feel there's a way that we've been encouraged to dislike or reject our bodies.
I'm going back to your good point about advertising and so many products for the body, as if we could or should master our body and determine our body, as if it is an ego function and a persona function to look a certain way. Anybody that wants to look at images from other cultures can see how mutable, fashion and physical appearance is. It's so culturally determined. That underscores your point, Lisa, about that's not a relationship. That does not honor the body or include the body. It's just dominating the body.
Yeah. Can I read another quote? This is by the French philosopher Montaigne, and I just love this quote. Those who wish to take our two principal pieces apart and to sequester one from the other are wrong. We must, on the contrary, couple and join them closely together. We must command the soul not to withdraw to its quarters, not to entertain itself apart, not to despise and abandon the body, something which it cannot do anyway, except by some monkey-like counterfeit, but to rally to it, take it in its arms and cherish it, help it, look after it, counsel it, and when it strays, set it to the rights and bring it back home again.
Oh, such a loving tone, almost echoing sort of mother and infant of being cherished.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And dear.
Yes, I wish we could cherish our bodies.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the point you made, Joseph, about alexithymia, one of those great jargony words. For people, many of us who just don't always know what we're feeling, of like something really bothered me about that. I don't know what it was. And we may kind of kick it around a little bit with a friend or someone in our family. Because that too is related to the body. That is where we feel things. And this links us up with Jung's complex theory of that when we are in a complex, something takes over. It has us rather than us having it. And it's a feeling and it has a bodily component. We know in our bodies when the hair on the back of our neck rises with fear or alarm, when we flush with shame, when we get red with anger, that our bodies are telling us. And if we're disconnected from our bodies, it's no wonder that may be the root of our lack of words for what we're feeling.
And that certain cultures promoted a devaluing of body information and therefore repress and actively suppress language that is descriptive. And we do that in our culture. Mm-hmm. There are certain words that are forbidden or should be sanitized. Fucking becomes koishin. That all of these language for the genitals become strange and mythologic or childlike. That all the vigor.
Yeah, poo-poo.
Right, exactly. all of these vigorous, dynamic realities of the body are powerful and they evoke enormous feeling. A moment ago, when I used the word fuck, I mean, I'm sure some of the people in the listening audience kind of clenched a little bit.
We could also get in trouble on the podcast.
Sorry about that, everybody. I'm being at the risk of being provocative, but also asking, why is that provocative?
Yes.
Why is that word so charged?
Yeah.
Because that word in our culture, at least in American culture, puts us in touch with an image and a body state that is numinous and intense and powerful and potent. And by controlling the language around that or banishing the language around that, we then try to separate our civilized consciousness away from it so that it falls into the shadow, just as we were talking about it.
And some of these bodily instincts really do get identified with a sort of grossness and ugliness and all the rest of it, which is why we do have some of these famous 4-letter words for it. We should rise above that. We should be above it rather than this is our instinctual nature, which has a gross aspect and it has a numinous, really powerfully invigorating and creative aspect as well.
And the two need to not be severed.
Yes.
And the word gross simply meant material. We've used that word, made it into grotesque, meaning that it's distorted or horrific.
Or disgusting, right.
But gross just meant of the body. So one of the ways that we can redeem this relationship to the body is by cultivating a language of phenomena instead of opinion. And by that I mean, when we're in a given situation, let's say you're having a conversation with a friend, can we scan the various realms that psyche manifests in and describe it to ourselves, at least, phenomenologically? So, for instance, you're at lunch with your buddy, and as they're talking, you just notice a tension across the chest. You begin to talk to yourself about how my chest and the muscles of my chest are contracting as I'm having this conversation, or the fact that some part of my body suddenly flushes with heat or my hands become cold. That just the language of it without even having to determine immediately exactly what it means.
Or whether you're going to do anything about it.
Or do anything about it is a way of just including in your own circle of consideration how the body is co-experiencing what's happening each minute.
I remember when I first became aware that my body had lots of subtle physical sensations that could inform me and guide me. I mean, I think I was like 30 before I kind of started tuning in. But it really was remarkable. I mean, it was like when it's like you've listened to the birds your whole life, but you've never really tuned in. And then you start tuning in and you think, oh, well, that's the chickadee and that's the cardinal. And you become aware that it's this really kind of rich realm that you just hadn't cottoned onto. That was very much what it was like. And although it still requires discipline for me to maintain connection with that, I definitely try to pay attention to what's going on in my body when I'm working with someone in analysis, because the little subtle cues that I get can often give me a clue about what direction we need to go in or help me pick up on something that's missing. And I try to also direct my analysand to notice what's going on in her body, which is really difficult for some people. We have not been taught to listen to our bodies.
I absolutely agree with you, Lisa. We simply have not been taught to pay attention to what's going on. And as a practical matter, something that is easy to do and can really yield some surprising dividends is just do a little body scan. Do one in the morning and one in the afternoon. It will take literally 2 minutes, if that. And just notice where there's sensation. of like, oh, my chest feels tight, or I think I've been clenching my jaw, oh, my shoulders, of just paying attention and listening. It isn't that you have to make some momentous meaning of it, but establishing a relationship and just listening in a little bit. Our bodies can tell us a lot.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing about that. It's not, I think sometimes when I ask people to notice what your body's feeling, they're really looking for those really obvious feelings that you feel in your body. Like if you've been, sitting in one position for a long time and your legs are cramped. It's not going to feel like that. It's subtle. And so you have to quiet down, empty your mind a little bit and sit with it for a second and see what you notice. And that's why it's a little bit of a practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit like if you're used to sort of traipsing noisily through the woods and then someone says, well, I want you to kind of notice where there's a chipmunk. You're going to have to be much quieter and you're going to have to try to tune in to the noises around you in order to do that. So it's a little bit like that. I'm going to just throw in one more quote here because I love this one. And it's very much apropos of what we're talking about. Jung says in the Zarathustra lectures, don't run away and make yourself unconscious of bodily facts, for they keep you in real life and help you not to lose your way in the world.
So in a way, I'm aware this language is so filled with sort of caring, relational tones that we're talking about befriending our physical selves and noticing, being curious, tuning in. It has a lot of information.
And so we have that gentle approach to the body, but I'd also like to say that we need to embrace our bodies with some vigor, that it is a vigorous mutual embrace, that the psychic life, our inner images and our thoughts, and the body need to take hold of each other and take hold vigorously and even passionately, that everything that you experience matters. And that's a pernicious phrase that I think haunts people greatly, that they're moving through the world and they're discounting various dimensions of life by saying, well, it just doesn't matter. What if everything that manifested in your field of awareness mattered? That doesn't mean it's all actionable. It doesn't mean we're interpreting it correctly initially, but that it matters, that your body feels a certain way, and that your mind is moving in a certain imaginal direction, and that certain images are rising up from your chest as you are daydreaming on the subway, but that all of that matters. Because it matters, that it then adds into the tapestry of decisions and evaluations that you will make in all the realms of power that you execute. Coming back to the Zarathustra ideas, and that's part of a religious and philosophic model, an ancient model. Zoroastrianism is one of the very, very ancient monotheistic religions. In that model, we have an ancient idea that the kingdom of spirit is embodied in your flesh.
Mm-hmm.
The tree of life has its roots in heaven, and its fruit is the physical earth. That there is a longed for realization of subtle principle that finally reaches its conclusion, its fullness, its ripeness, and its desire in the physical world. That the physical world isn't a horrible mistake that we have to escape from. Once we stop evaluating the physical world in terms of personal comfort, and we step away and imagine the world from the standpoint of the objective psyche, the physical world is the great churning end product of both cosmic processes, which our theoretical physicists are talking about, as well as deep deep internal and intimate personal desires and longings, that the entire universe churns towards the body, the embodiment of a tree, or the embodiment of your infant daughter that was just born, or your embodiment right now as you're listening and contemplating these ideas, that these are all conclusions of immensely powerful processes that make this moment for you happen, that can't be avoided.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, Joseph. So the body is the incarnation of spirit. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It was lovely, and it's so important. It's a gift that we can have these bodies, eyesight, physical touch, be aware of beauty. This is really very, very special, and we should value the gift of it.
And that this idea sacralizes the manifest world.
Yes.
Because if we can own the body as the great conclusion of all the disparate parts that come together, then every place you stand is sacred space.
And our bodies are sacred.
Exactly.
You know, in some quarters, kind of a regressive belief, maybe, you know, my body is a temple, but there's truth to it, that the body is sacred. Just another quote to back up your lovely discourse there, Joseph. Jung says, the spirit consists of possibilities. One could say the world of possibilities was the world of the spirit. The spirit can be anything, but the earth can only be something definite. So remaining true to the earth would mean maintaining your conscious relationship to the body. So it's that which is not just in potential, but which has been incarnated in space and time.
There's another role that the body plays, which is so essential for individuation. And we avoid this test through kind of schizoid withdrawal from, quote unquote, incarnating, is that the body disciplines consciousness to bring forward its potential. And one of the ways that we avoid that discipline is by refusing to embody our life goals, refusing to embody our desire for a relationship. And instead, we retreat and we have fantastical ideas that we masturbate to instead of actually contending in the world. Or we think we could have been in this or that profession, but going through the discipline of consciousness and body, for that matter, in order to manifest that career is avoided. Incarnation demands a certain rigor and refinement of the ego, which I would compare to the tempering of metal. There's this wonderful metallurgic term called torturing the metal. And we've known this since the time that metal was being worked with, that if you make a sword, let's say out of iron, and you plunge it into the furnace and get it as hot as you can, and then you hammer it out into a sharp edge, you plunge it into water, you pick it out, you plunge it back into fire, you plunge it back into water, and the rapid expansion and rapid contraction of the molecules of the iron over and over and over again causes the metal to become stronger and more resilient. It actually changes its composition. And so incarnating our hopes and dreams and desires causes them to experience that same hot and cold tension of the opposites as we incarnate, which allows us to become more refined human beings, stronger.
So what you're saying is you cannot individuate in spirit only. Living in the realm of the possible is not the individuation task. That's more along the lines of the provisional life. Incarnating means really bringing it down into the earth in some kind of physical manifestation. And it's painful and it's a loss in a way, but it's also how to embrace this existence.
I'm appreciating the images that you're offering, especially the one of tempering. And I'm thinking that, yes, it's the realm of the possible and the realm of limitation, otherwise known as reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are called to live in this realm, in these bodies, in this whatever landscape, environment, physical realities are in your world, and the limitations that we have. Of it may not be your physical destiny to become a ballerina, for example, or to do other certain kinds of things, but we are called to have that kind of encounter or confrontation and relationship in all of its dimensions with our bodies and with the rest of the physical realm. This is our task, and this is the task of individuation.
And there are so many currents in our culture, and we've spoken about some of them, that encourage us to kind of disincarnate. And I do think that, increased time on screens contributes to that. I don't want to overly demonize that. But I think that there are some concerns about, say, teenagers who are doing most of their socializing online. And what does that mean for the body? What does that mean for coming into your sexuality?
There are so many core threshold experiences that we feel emerging imaginally first. For instance, the first time we take a lover is a threshold experience. Moving from boyhood or maidenhood into finally finding a lover that we're attracted to, allowing somebody to have access to our bodies, at first in all the fumbling ways that we all do that, and then refining it into a language of intimacy and joy and passion and vigor and all the things that we hope will happen. That what the soul and the body have to go through to transition into the incarnated experience of intimacy changes us, matures us. When those fantasies are left disembodied, they actually become a kind of poison that draws us out of life. So von Franz said something really potent, that what is inside of us must be made manifest. Our creative impulses in all their dimensions have to be made manifest, or else they become a kind of poison. So for instance, if we think about this metaphor of sexual engagement, in a young man's psyche, those images of sexual engagement are so powerful, they exert such a gravitational field, that when they are left in the imaginal world, they can draw the ego into these imaginal sexual and self-stimulating environments, and they can reach a pitch, which I've seen in my practice, where young men can be caught for hours and hours a day in this self-stimulating reverie. And maybe they'll add pornography into it, for instance. Because that sexual energy is so dynamic, it is such a furnace of life power, it can become one of the most important several hours of a day that a person who's caught like that could have. It becomes more important and more luminous than a lot of other lived things. And so the incarnation of the sexuality, however it designs itself, is essential in order to take that inner energy and canalize it, to put it into channels, which then becomes a new kind of engine to manifest all kinds of things, including finding appropriate physical partners. It becomes the engine for work. It becomes the engine for ambition. It becomes the engine that generates a certain kind of authority in the world, so that we are not ephemeral and insubstantial as people. So lots of things like gaming, and I understand a lot of my clients and a lot of my friends enjoy gaming, but when gaming is the place where too much of the internal images are thought to be playing out, but are not really, then it becomes a trap.
Yeah, it's sort of over spiritualized, right?
Or trapped in spirit, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So can I put another quote in to just back up everything you just said so beautifully? Jung says, if we forget that we also consist of a living body and try to live in an entirely spiritual medium, the body is going to suffer. And inasmuch as the body suffers, the mind will be affected too. It is a terrible strain on our minds when we are not right with our bodies. I think we're even just advocating, like, you have to kind of take care of your body. You have to be in your body and exercise and eat well and sleep enough and all those other things that we have to do because we're animals.
Mm-hmm.
Jung also was interested in Kundalini Yoga at a certain point in his life and wrote a book on his analysis of some texts of Kundalini Yoga. And he was introduced to that science, or that yogic science, that the very subtle refinement of the physical body allows extraordinary states of consciousness to be explored and to be claimed. Now, neuroscience is playing this out really explicitly, that if your brain doesn't function in certain ways, you don't get to experience consciousness in certain ways. The great experimenters in Kundalini Yoga were saying the same thing, experimenting with methods to refine how the nerve forces flow or don't flow in the physical body, leaning towards an expansion of consciousness. Jung was interested in this. He's criticized in his writings for being not as informed as he might have been. I disagree with that, given the time and the access that he had to those recently translated texts. But he was feeling his way into this reality, even as he was writing about alchemy, that the psycho-spiritual and physical development of a human being leads to the incarnation of psychological qualities that could not happen without the body. And the refinement of the body on the very subtle levels.
I wanted to just see if we could lift this up into an archetypal image realm here with a myth or a fairy tale. And one of the things that came up for me is the story of Pinocchio. You know, I imagine that there aren't a lot of fairy tales about problems with embodiment because this wasn't such an issue until more recent times, which may be why the thing that occurred to me is a relatively recent work of fiction. Pinocchio, I think we're in the realm of the attachment stuff that we referenced earlier. You know, Pinocchio is not in a real body. He's longing after a real body, but he doesn't quite know how to get there. It's also touching into the things that I think you were talking about, Joseph, about needing to kind of actualize rather than stay in a fantasy realm. That is the quest that Pinocchio must undertake. And he must kind of integrate the shadow and materialize his desires and his worthy impulses before he can be granted the body of a real boy.
And how does he learn? Well, you know, we all know about how his nose would extend whenever he told a lie. So there's a bodily manifestation. And eventually, because I forget what further infraction he committed, but he has to go to the island, the donkey island, where kids are turned into donkeys. And I think he sprouts ears and a tail to his horror. I'm not underestimating the role of metaphor here in the story, but it's interesting that it is bodily manifestation. It's not just a morality, you know, sort of concept. This is what will happen to you. And then he finally turns into a real boy, a flesh and blood child. But he has to grow through his bodily awareness of attachment and right and wrong and relationship and choice and all the rest of it.
It has to be introduced to the world that turns people into donkeys.
Mm-hmm.
That it's okay when he's fashioned by Geppetto as an ideal boy that is just Geppetto's fantasy of a boy. But then he has to transgress, run away, he has to go to this fair that's full of all these sensuous delights, and he has to begin to move into this donkey-making part of himself to know about that in order to come back and to have the potential to be transformed into a real boy, again, through this magic of the blue fairy. But it's also a part of puberty, by the way, going from, a 10-year-old boy who's really happy and compliant with everything into this kind of donkey-like, smelly, fussy, muscular teenager who doesn't want to be told anything, and then deciding to come home with all of that donkey-like stubbornness and physicality and decide that being part of the family and the home is a good thing.
Right. And that is an image of shadow work, right? Of integrating the shadow. And of course, we cannot be substantial if we do not cast a shadow. This is getting back to the shadow and the body and the relationship between those things and the need to claim and integrate that because it gives us substance and materiality in the world.
Exactly. That all these donkey bodies that we walk around in that need care and need love and need to be included in the model of what it means to be human can't be set aside, like so many religious ideals claim to do.
Mm-hmm. So just to amplify the story of Pinocchio a little bit, there's this wonderful film by Steven Spielberg called AI, which is kind of a sci-fi version of Pinocchio. And it really, I think, underscores what we've been talking about today. When things stay in the spiritual realm and there's never a body. And there's this little boy who is a robot, essentially, who is longing to be a real boy and to be seen as one and to be loved. And it never happens.
I found that modernized version to be so poignant, so deeply moving, and particularly the abandonment of the boy, the AI out in the forest. The idea that people can be used like objects and then disposed of when they serve their purpose was so painfully poignant in that movie.
Yeah, and I think in both Pinocchio and in AI, there's this sense that when there's been significant attachment disruption, we don't feel real to ourselves. And we may have a very difficult time coming into relationship with our bodies.
I'm just sitting for a moment thinking about the developmental or clinical arc with any of our clients and Alisans that have demonstrated that similar kind of incarnational, real making dynamism.
Mm-hmm. That's a hard road to walk.
It is a hard road to walk. I think, as you said, that many people who are struggling to incarnate have some really substantial trauma history in early childhood, so that staying in what feels like a spiritual level is the only survivable place and may have been the only survivable place for the first number of years of life. And then the path forward into the body has been forgotten, or, like Kalshad suggests, may have these terrible guardians situated on that path, making it seem too frightening to finally travel into the body, into lived sensations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like there's so much more we could talk about with this. It's such a huge topic and such an important one, but perhaps it's time to switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Today's dreamer is a 24-year-old woman who is a student, and here's the dream. I was waiting for a young man to pick me up for a second date, but he was late. I was in a park, and there was a fair, and I ran into some of my childhood friends who were quite surprised about my date. So they started harassing me with questions about who he was, and mostly why he was late. I didn't have his phone number, so I didn't know. I had with me a backpack, laptop, Kindle, handbag, another bag, and my stuff kept falling on the ground, and I had to pick it up over and over. It was raining hard. Hours had passed, and I decided to walk through the fair. There, I bought a unicorn-shaped mug that immediately fell off my hands and became ash as it hit the ground. I was tired and cold and went sitting under a large tree. In the tall grass emerged a group of people who were shooting at wild ducks. From that direction, the man I was waiting for finally arrived. She says, I had this dream before my second date with a man I am now entering a difficult relationship with. And the main feelings were, I felt a sense of abandonment and anguish, and I felt physically strained. The dream was gloomy, wet, and cold. And then she says, for some additional context, my past relationships have been abusive and traumatic. I wish I could become emotionally intimate with someone, but I feel nearly impossible to be at ease around any man I have a sexual relationship with.
So because of her association, I feel it's tempting to want to use the dream to simply affirm the conscious attitude of, having a bad picker. But just basically choosing the wrong men or women to have relationships with. But something inside of me wants to set that aside and look at the dream as a purely intrapsychic phenomena, that the ego has a certain relationship to the idea of the animus or the inner masculine, how to relate to it, how to struggle around it. And that the dream may be pointing to some kind of pattern that is more at the base of why the relationship with these men may just be difficult.
Yeah, I definitely can find that in clinical work, that when the animus is, when there's a difficult relationship with the inner masculine, the outer relationships often reflect that. So I'm right with you, Joseph.
I'm aware of the kind of polarities between sort of a harsh reality and then the tendency to go off into some sort of very super positive realm, that it's sort of a really two extremes of, for example, she's in a park. There's a fair. Later on, she goes walking through the fair. She buys this unicorn-shaped mug, so that there's all this sort of lovely fantasy, fun kind of imagery. But then he's late. He's not only late, he's hours late. It's raining. She's still waiting. The mug falls and becomes ash, so that it's a sort of an either-or construct. And to my mind, the mediating force here is the friends. That the friends show up. Now they're harassing her, she says, with questions about why he was late. But I'm curious about that element in her shadow that at least speaks to, hey, this doesn't add up here. What's going on? And they're friends, images of something she's connected to in psyche, perhaps part of a positive, part of shadow.
I don't know that I'm feeling that about the friends. I mean, maybe, but there's a way that this almost has a little bit of a Cinderella feeling to it. You know, she's kind of waiting to go to the ball. And the friends remind me a little bit of the kind of evil stepsisters, that kind of energy. And there is this appeal to the mother principle by sitting under a large tree, which effectively happens in the Grimm's version of Cinderella. So there's this sense of kind of being abandoned and beset by forces that are being very demanding on the ego, by these inner forces that are making all kinds of demands on the ego. And that she can't kind of keep hold of her things. She keeps on dropping things, right?
Yes.
She's dropping her stuff. She drops the mug. So kind of an ego that's almost overtaxed from demands from the inner world is something that I'm seeing, I think.
I have a similar kind of suspicion about the inner images. But I find myself looking at the transition between passivity and activity in the dream. And I think that we're looking at this movement from a puella stance of passivity, of waiting for fill in the blank, waiting for the man to show up, not having his number, not knowing how to call him, dropping, your book bag, filled with all this stuff that a kid might even have with them. She has trouble holding things in her own hands. She can't keep her book bag on. She can't keep the mug in her hand. Her grip is loose on these things. So she's waiting. Her grip is loose. Things are kind of frayed and disorganized. And then she makes a decision. She decides to walk through the fair, which is a really strong position and a sense of personal autonomy and power. And then she goes and decides to sit under a tree. And both of those things have a defining quality in her psyche that I really like. And then the animus that arrives shortly after that is a hunter. That's a very kind of ancient and mature archetype of the masculine. It's not terribly sentimental. It may even be somewhat coarse, but it suggests that she has an inner hunter that could be a great asset to her.
Yeah, yeah.
Somebody goes out into the wild and finds what they need and goes and acquires it, whether they have to shoot it or find it or harvest it. But there's something active about this fellow walking in. And
it's significant that he arrives after she sits in under the large tree. It's like when then, there's sort of when she appeals to, I want to say kind of the mother principle and comes into a relationship with that which can be protective in the mother principle. That's i.e. the tree. Then she is able to be in relationship to this positive animus energy.
Although the dream doesn't say that he's with the group of hunters, but there is a group of people who were shooting at wild ducks. And, I appreciate your take on that, but I'm thinking about what's a duck and a group of people. It's kind of undifferentiated, and it doesn't evoke in me the image of hunters doing something that's really directed. It feels somehow just more sort of chaotic and killing, really undirected energy. And then from that direction, the man who she's waiting for has arrived. So, I think I'm in the somewhat contrarian position with this dream here, but I'm a little skeptical of this group of people shooting at wild ducks.
It's hard to know, right? I flip-flopped myself. I was like, what about those people shooting at the wild ducks? And Joseph, I think when you said hunter, I was like, yeah, that totally works. But Deb, it's not like I had the same question, like how I'd be really, if I had the dreamer, I would be really curious about what about those wild ducks, because this is the this is the kind of resolution of the dream, right? This is the lysis of it. Is she sits under the tree, the wild ducks are being shot at, he comes. So like it's really important, and I think it's also where the telos might be in this dream. I don't know that we know exactly, but I'm I can get behind Joseph's. It's like he's a hunter. He's coming from the direction of these people who apparently are hunting.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. He's coming from that direction. So something seems to be emerging. But my suspicion about some of this dream is that there is a real tendency toward fantasy with the unicorn mug and walking through the fair.
Yeah.
I get the archetypal symbolism of the tree as a great mother. And the tree is a huge symbol. But I'm not sure she's really found a place where she is choosing and deciding. It's more sort of meandering, and yet something emerging that has to do with her own sense of agency in some respect.
I want to go back to the unicorn mug for just a second because Deb, I think
thank you.
I agree with what you said about the unicorn mug, and interestingly, it turns to ash, which is what happens when we burn something, and we often burn something in a ritual or a sacrifice. So it could be that the fantasy image has been sacrificed or is in the process of being sacrificed, not through any conscious decision on her part. It's sort of been taken out of her hands, as it were. But she may be in some process around that because that's a very particular thing that it turns to ash.
Well, I also like the unicorn slipping out of her hand because unicorns and virgins have this mythologic connection. And there's something about letting go of the unicorn is part of letting go of the puella fantasies. Let go of the fair. Let go of your friends judging whether or not your boyfriend is good enough for you because he was late. Let go of the unicorns, in your life. And there's this deep potentiation that finally happens at the end of all the puella failures, which is that she's just tired and cold. And I think that people don't give up their puella addictions until they're just tired and cold. And there isn't any distraction, youthful distraction, that is good enough to actually warm me up or make me feel held or gives me satisfaction. So I agree with you, Deb, that this dream isn't at a conclusion. She's in the middle of a process. And although being tired and cold and sitting under a tree for shelter, it's not a terribly romantic image, but as Lisa said, finding shelter in nature and at least admitting I'm tired and cold and I need help at some point. That's all, I think, very positive. And even if we don't know for sure if the group of people, are hunters or what's going on with that, but at least there's energy. She's tired and cold, and some other part of the psyche that's got vitality, that's not tired and cold, is galumphing around, with guns and engaging the natural world in some fashion or other. They've got the energy, she doesn't.
And they've got the aggression. And
they're kind of coming towards her, and she recognizes someone in the group that she can have a connection with in the form of the person she was waiting for. There's a whole part of the story, like, how's that all going to play out? How's it all going to get negotiated? That's, off the table. We have no idea.
Well, I'm going to go back to my idea about the friends, because I think there's kind of a doubling here based on what you just said, Joseph, about, this energy emerges with the shooters and the guy appears. But I think it is, just sort of hinted at with the friends earlier in the dream of this aggressive energy. They're harassing her, or the dream ego perceives their questions as harassment, but they may be sort of a call to reality. They say they're surprised. They ask questions, we might say.
They're like psyche's sisters.
Yes.
And that's a call to consciousness.
Yeah. Call to consciousness. I mean, is that really harassment? They want to know who he is, and they want to know why he's late. And I see that as perhaps, as you said, Lisa, like Cinderella's stepsisters. Maybe that's what starts the action, is that sense of being spurred on. The dream ego doesn't like it, but that's what leads her to start wandering through the fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. And, the same way that Psyche's sisters in the story of Psyche and Eros cause her to, light the candle, which, sort of sets the whole story in motion, really.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then there is this, with the breaking of the mug, there is this sense of a kind of collapse of these infantile fantasies, but then that kind of necessary subordination of the ego that says, I just have to give up because what I was doing before isn't working. Mm-hmm. And then something new arises.
Yes.
So it's a right fairy tale, isn't it, this dream?
It does. She says something very poignant, which you had mentioned in reading the dream. My past relationships have been abusive and traumatic. I wish I could become emotionally intimate with someone, but I feel nearly impossible to be at ease around any man I have a sexually intimate relationship with. So the unicorn does have to die. And the friends who are basically intimating, no one's good enough for you. You better get rid of him because he's late. They don't say that, but it's a trope in the culture of, girls. Who's good enough for you, princess, kind of attitude. And that she may need to be reduced to a very vulnerable, tired place in order for her defenses against intimacy to finally get exhausted. And I remember moments like that in my own analysis, that I was, I was in the middle of reviewing one more iteration of my childhood trauma. And my analyst just kind of looked at me, sympathetically. And I just stopped myself and I said, I cannot stand myself. I am so bored with my story. I just cannot tell you this story one more damn time. And that was the liberating moment. It's like I was tired and wet. I was sitting under a tree and I couldn't schlock out the damn trauma story. Now, a dream is 24. Her trauma may be much more raw and closer to her than it was to me at that time. But there does need to come to a point where identifying with being a trauma victim has kind of finished. It's just exhausted. We've wrung all of the feeling out of it. We're tired of being alone and feeling bad, feeling screwed up, basically. We get tired of it.
Yeah.
And finally, which is a real journey, by the way, that can't be bypassed. And then we're tired of all of that. Something possible can come forward from within us. Many of our listeners have written in to say how much they specifically enjoy the dream interpretation portion of our podcast, which, as our listeners know, we love doing. It's so high-spirited. If that's been really great for you, consider joining Dream School. We'd love to see you there, and you can participate much more vigorously with us and learning how to interpret dreams. So give it a shot.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.